Welcome, everyone. I hope you got a chance to grab a slice of pizza. Invite you to finishing that and grab a seat. We're so glad that you're here today for the God and Race Does God See Color talk. My name is Kevna. I'm going to be your MC for today. I graduated from the University of Toronto. I studied global health, bioethics, and Christianity and culture. So as Christian organizers of this event, we believe that all lands and all peoples were created by God. So we want to start by acknowledging that the land on which U of T lies is on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. We thank these First Peoples who continue to live on these lands and care for them, and whose relationship to these lands existed long before the founding of Canada. We are grateful to be able to live, to learn, and to play on these lands. So thank you everyone for being able to join us during today and during the relevant series. If you are here for the first time, we've had a whole week long of dialogues and talks about faith, culture, science, life, and other relevant topics. Today we're going to be focusing on God and race. And as many of you may have experienced, conversations about race have been prevalent all around us. We're going to dive into this topic from a unique perspective today as we look at God and race. We also recognize that many of you in this room might have different opinions and sometimes maybe polarizing views on race discussions. So I just want to remind you all to be respectful. We want to maintain inclusive and safe spaces as we dialogue and we participate in the discussion today. So to help us navigate this question, does God see color? We're thrilled to welcome Rose Thompson, who is currently the Chief of Staff and Consultant for Crew City, where she encourages Christian leadership to see, understand, and act in our ethnically and culturally diverse world. Rose has over 20 years of experience serving with this campus Christian group, including many years of campuses in the US and nearly 12 years serving in South Africa. Rose comes from a Jamaican heritage, and we're so glad to be able to hear from her today. After Rose comes up and shares, we're going to have a time of audience Q&A, and at any point during this talk, you can go to slido.com, type in the code RELEVANT2023, and insert a question in there. On that same link, you'll have the option to upvote questions. So if there's a question you see there that you'd really like answered, make sure to upvote that so we can prioritize answering those questions. Let's put our hands together and warmly welcome Rose to come up now.
So I was sitting on the steps of the ferry, waiting for the ferry to go to Robben Island. Had just gotten into the country, and I sit down and I look at, there's a young man next to me, and so I start chatting with him. I don't know him. I just strike up a conversation. And as we're talking, we're engaging in this conversation, and he's looking at me, but not quite looking at me. Have you ever had that experience where you're talking to somebody and you can tell they're a little distracted? So he's looking at me and he's answering my questions, and we're having conversation, but I can tell something else is going on. And surely in the middle of the conversation, he blurts out, "Are you Black?" And I'm thinking, okay, look at me. Like, I'm dark, semi-sweet chocolate. How does anyone question whether I'm Black? And so I'm thrown by this question. And I say, of course I'm Black. What else would I be? And he still seems confused. So I start to explain about my heritage. I'm Jamaican, raised in America. That's why I'm speaking English. But I'm of Jamaican heritage. My ancestors were the slaves that came from Africa. Like, I'm going back to explain. And he's finally like, oh, okay. And then we continue our conversation. That exchange happened about 20 years ago. And it has left a mark on me. Not just because my racial identity was questioned, which still surprises me because, hello. But more so because it's made me intrigued by, one, our need to classify other people, to be able to put them in the box of what group do you belong to? How can I relate to you based on the group that you belong to, right? And so as we're talking today about race, I want us to lay a little bit of ground rules about our definition of race, because we often use terms like, racism's happening, systemic racism or institutional racism, or that person might be racist, and emotions and feelings. In fact, I might suspect that even as I'm saying those things now, emotions and feelings might be happening. But I want us to we're going to spend a little time looking at this issue of race. And I want us to start with, there we go. Let's start with making sure we have the same definition, okay? So I don't know if you can see that. Webster's dictionary defines race as any one of the groups that humans are often divided into based on physical traits that are regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. I like actually this definition in the book, Ethnicity and Race, Making Identities in a Changing World by Stephen Cornell and Douglas Hartman. They give this description: a human condition defined by itself or others as distinct by virtue of perceived common physical characteristics that are held to be inherent. Determining which characteristics constitute the race is a choice human beings make. Neither markers nor categories are predetermined by any biological factors. See, this concept of race is actually a relatively new concept if we look at the continuum of human history. It's really only been in the last 500 years or so that this division amongst people based on physical characteristics has been an issue. Now, don't get me wrong, people have been dividing themselves from others for as long as people have been alive. But it hasn't necessarily been on physical characteristics: the color of your skin, the texture of your hair, the shape of your eyes, the fullness of your lips. That was not an issue way back. Sure, the Greeks thought they were better than everyone else, and the Romans thought they were better than everyone else, but they thought they were better than other people that looked just like them. The English thought they were better than the Irish. Similar physical features, right? So there was an ethnicity, the people groups who identify as different or elevate themselves among others. But around the late 1400s, early 1500s, this change started to happen. And people started to try to explain, why are there physical differences? Why is there differences in skin pigmentation amongst people? And out of this came this interesting phenomena, an idea and concept of race. It really started developing even deeper around the time of colonization. And so when colonization started taking place, then this thought of, okay, how do we characterize people based on racial traits? In 1684, a man by the name of Francois Bernier, and I'm probably pronouncing his surname incorrectly, so please forgive me. He wrote a book called an article called A New Division of Earth, A New Division of the Earth. And that's where he identified 5 individual races, all based on physical trait. David Hume follows, Immanuel Kant follows, and they continue to build this concept of this 5 distinct races of people based on physical trait. Isn't it interesting? That happened in 1684. Before, no one ever thought about that. And suddenly, all of us in this room have been affected by what has been almost a given. In our worlds, race almost seems like it's a given, but it is in fact what we call a social construct. It was created by human beings as a way to distinguish one another for the rationale of power. The purpose of it is if I can make a judgment on one group of people versus another based on the way they look, I can justify slavery. I can justify treating another group inhumanely because of physical features. And that is exactly what happened. It made it easier to justify the Atlantic slave trade based on now there's these books and these scholars that are saying that if your skin is darker or your hair is thicker, then you're not as intelligent as someone whose skin is lighter and their hair is straighter, despite the fact that there is absolutely no biological basis for this. In fact, now it is common knowledge amongst most scientists that there's more variation within a group of people that are classified as one race than between races. So if you think about, for example, people who are classified, in the US especially, people who are classified as Black, many variations, right? You can have someone who's light skinned, you can have someone who's really dark, but all fall under the classification of Black. More variation within the race than between races. And this is something that we've created. And yet, while we know this, or many of us know that this is a social construct, it's not biologically legitimate, we all have to deal with the reality of it. Systems have been built as though this was legitimate. And we're now having this conversation because things have happened based on this illusion of there is a true distinction amongst people based on their physical traits. Wherever you go in the world, if you look differently from the majority of people around you, someone's going to notice, right? We pay attention, we can't help it. We pay attention to things that are different. And I don't know if, how many of you ever watched Sesame Street? Hey, okay. So I don't know if the Canadian version of Sesame Street had the game One of These Things. Did they do that? Yeah. Big Bird. Y'all know who Big Bird is, right? Okay. Big Bird would have 4 different things. It's a really big yellow bird. And you would have to identify which one of those things are different. And so at a very young age, we start paying attention to what is different. In fact, by the age of 18 months, a baby can tell the difference between colors. By age 4, if a child cannot tell the difference between colors, doctors begin to do diagnostic work to see if they have a vision deficiency called color blindness, a visual deficiency. And scholars are now debating about the age at which children even start to identify racial differences, what we have now as society classified as race. By some scholars say as early as age 4, children could detect this. One of my nephews, when he was probably about 5 years old, he would come home and tell my sister about things that happened in his daycare. And so when he first started coming and telling her, he would tell her about, oh, there was this white girl in my class and she did X, Y, and Z. And then, another day he came home and said, oh, there's this blue boy in my class and he did X, Y, and Z. And so my sister's realizing, okay, wait, what? And then, another time it was the brown girl in class. And then it was the yellow girl in class. And my sister's trying to figure out who are these people until she discovered he was talking about the color shirt that they were wearing that day. For him, his identification was, oh, he was wearing a blue shirt, so that's a blue boy, right? It wasn't based on skin color, although he noticed skin color, but that wasn't the difference in how he was describing the children. We pay attention. We pay attention to these things. And if we don't see color then we have a vision impairment. But we're talking today about God, right? Whether God sees color. When I talk about God, I'm talking from the perspective of the Christian faith, the Judeo-Christian God and the Bible, and whether he sees race. Does God have this vision deficiency where he is colorblind, as many people hold to that, or does he actually see color? This is touchy. This is a touchy subject because historically, there are people that have justified the separation and mistreatment of other people based on their belief in God. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But I want us to think about this, this premise that God is colorblind, because I think many people have said that. You may have heard someone say, God doesn't see color. He doesn't care where you're from. He loves us all the same, right? Well, that's interesting. And so I think a generous interpretation of what's being said when someone says that is that the God of the Bible doesn't play favorites. That each person that's made in the image of God, and the Bible teaches, for those of us who are followers of Christ and believe from the Judeo-Christian Bible that we are all made by God, that there's an inherent value in humans just because they're made by God. And so God doesn't preface one type of human over another type of human. So I think when people are saying that, a generous interpretation is that's the intent. God loves those with light skin. He loves those with dark skin. He loves the thick, curly red hair, all of it. That those are the physical traits that he loves in all of us. It's interesting, though, that when we think about that, if we think, well, that must mean that God must be colorblind. But one of the writers in the Bible, in the book of Songs, Psalm, one of the writers, it was a king that wrote, he's processing God's involvement in his life. And he talks about the fact that God made him and was forming him while he was still in utero, while he's still inside his mom. Later, another writer, centuries later, another writer of the Bible, the Apostle Paul, talks about the fact that God, through Jesus, created everything. Everything was created by God. And he even establishes where we're going to live, like where we'll be born. So this is interesting. If the God of the Bible doesn't care about these things, but he made us, and he knows like where in the world we're going to be born, it's almost as if God is truly colorblind, there must be this cosmic bookshelf, right, that has hair color and skin color, and he just, as he's making somebody, just kind of grabs something and throws it in. But that's not consistent with the God of the Bible if you're reading the Bible. If you're reading the Bible, the God of the Bible is into detail. He pays attention to detail. The stories of the Old Testament, many of those stories make sure that we understand that God is paying attention to detail. Stories of how to build a place of worship. I mean, the detail to the type of material and the color of the material. Stories of how to build a really big ship. The detail of the dimensions. So it seems inconsistent that a God who pays attention to that level of detail suddenly doesn't care what my skin color is. That just doesn't make sense. I want to cause us to think about something differently and to ponder that maybe God is not colorblind. And actually, if I'm honest, I think it's an insult to say that he is. because I believe that his intentionality, the intentionality of having people born on the continent of Africa, the intentionality of having people born of Asian descent in Canada, the intentionality of having Indigenous people with the flavor and beauty of Indigenous culture was intentional. And to overlook that, to whitewash it, to say it blends in with everything else is an insult to the intentionality of creation and of what God did. These things should be celebrated, right? Our differences should be celebrated. I mean, if you look around the room, the flavor, the color, whether it's our clothing, whether it's our hair, whether it's our hairstyle, whatever it may be, it adds flavor. It's a variety, and not to be glossed over, but to be celebrated and appreciated as a reflection of beauty in diversity. Unfortunately, the very reason we're having this conversation today is because of the damage that's been done in the past. In recent years, especially in the past 3 years since what's happened and I think kind of the global awakening that happened when George Floyd was killed, this sudden, and I hesitate to use the word sudden, but there certainly was a surge of awareness for those who had experienced discrimination for years before. There was no awakening that happened on May 26th. But for others, there was an awakening that happened, and this dialogue began in terms of, okay, how does God factor into this? Because unfortunately, many have justified the superiority of one group of people over another group of people in the name of God, which again, I think is an insult to him. This posturing of one race over another is part of the history of my heritage in Jamaica. It's part of the history of the heritage in the United States and part of the history of the heritage of Canada. In many parts of the world, this discrimination from the Iberian Peninsula and what happened in the 1400s with the Inquisition, this discrimination has affected all of us. And it's distorted our understanding of who God is. It's distorted our perception of what does it look like to appreciate God's appreciation of our variety and difference. Now we're talking about race, but there is a difference between race and ethnicity. And so, there we go. Oh, mercy. There we go. When we talk about ethnicity, we're talking, is someone tracking with me in time? So I'm going to wave me down and let me know when my time is up. No? Yes, okay. When we're talking about ethnicity, the definition of ethnicity, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, is of or relating to large groups of people classified or classed according to common racial, national, tribal, religious, linguistic, or cultural origin or background. So as we have this conversation about God and race and God and ethnicity, the Bible actually talks a lot about ethnicity. It's again one of those things that fascinates me, this belief that God is colorblind, because from the very first book in the Bible, in Genesis, to the very last book, there is references about people's ethnic background in almost every book of the Bible. In almost every book, people's ethnicity is referred to. What is significant is that there isn't preference or an increased value on one people group versus another. And with ethnicity, many ethnic groups could belong to one race, as I mentioned before, right? So when we talk about how does God see ethnicity? How does he value ethnicity? There's an image in the very last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, that describes this beautiful picture of many people coming together to worship God. And it describes it as being people from every people group, every language, every nation, because there's a beauty of being able to appreciate the variety of people. Remember, the inability to see color is a deficiency. Masking over color is a deficiency. If it all blends in, that's a problem. We need to be able to appreciate the difference, not elevate one or the other. One is not better than the other. But we need to be able to appreciate the value just as God does, the beauty. When I bring my full Jamaican self into the room, when my friend Esther brings her full Chinese self into the room, when someone else brings their full Dutch self into the room, there's a beauty that can happen when we appreciate those without ascribing to either one or any of them a greater than or less than value. That's the beauty of God. He is not colorblind, and we shouldn't be either. Now, I'm sure you probably have some thoughts, so I'd love to hear them.
Thanks so much, Rose. I really loved how you took that premise of God being colorblind and pointed out how it's not in consistency with the God of the Bible, who's attentive to detail and has great intentionality. Really appreciated that. So we're going to move into a Q&A time. I'm going to remind you that you can submit your questions on slido.com, #relevant, or the code is relevant 2023. Christianity Explorer. This is it's a free and informal course where you can learn about the Christian faith. There's 7 sessions together. There's free food. You get to watch a short film and have discussions together. So we'll play a short trailer for that so you can see that quickly.
You might be a convinced atheist, a committed Christian, or somewhere in between. Perhaps you've lots of questions to ask, or perhaps you're happier just sitting and listening. Maybe you go to church, or maybe you've never been. Whoever you are, Christianity Explored is a place for you to explore what life is all about. The Christianity Explored course is free, it's relaxed and informal, and it's run by ordinary people local to you. Some courses are held in churches with lots of people. Some are held in people's houses with just a few friends getting together. Wherever you meet, in each session, there's a chance to look at the life of Jesus for yourself and ask any questions you have. There's a short video to watch, and then a chance to chat about what you've just heard. You'll meet great people. You won't be asked to sing or pray or read out loud, and you don't need to know anything about the Bible to enjoy it. So whoever you are, come and explore. There's almost certainly a Christianity Explored course starting near you soon. So ask a Christian friend, or check out the website to find out more. You might just discover that the Christian message really is the best news you've ever heard.
Hopefully that gave you a quick glimpse of what that course is like. So as we move into Q&A, you can upvote questions at any point. You can see Rose behind me. We've also got Esther Wong, and so I'm just going to introduce her briefly. She's worked with Power to Change for 21 years at different campuses across Canada, including the greater Vancouver area, as well as Guelph, where she currently lives with her husband, Silas. She's currently on the national leadership team for P2C students and has played a role in leading organizational intercultural development in Power to Change. So Esther, thank you for joining us with Rose today.
Thank you, Kevna. And thank you, Rose. Thank you for all that you shared today with us about the intentionality of God and how God celebrates and appreciates the differences of all people that he has created, and that God is not colorblind. So I'm curious to know, as we're waiting for questions to continue to trickle in, have you always held these beliefs about God, that he's not colorblind, that he values all the differences of different people? Yeah, and if not, what's changed over time? Or even if so, what's changed over time and what's influenced those changes?
Great question. I was raised in a Christian home. And my dad, his experience growing up in Jamaica when he was in school, and my dad's old. So when he was in school and they were talking about the history of Jamaica, his teachers wouldn't talk to him about where the Black people came from on the island. So he only learned about the history of slavery and what that meant after he became an adult. When he was about 21, he connected with some Rastafarians who taught him and exposed him to the history. He was so committed that we would not have that story, that he made sure that we understood who we were as part of the diaspora from Africa. But then he also, because he was a Christ follower, would make sure that we understood from Genesis. He would point out throughout the scripture, this is where Africans are represented. This is where the Middle East is. This is where, and so being able to see that. So I grew up with very much the strong sense of God loves a wide variety of people. He is intentional with that. So you have held this, probably become more passionate about it since I've experienced of my own injustices and discrimination has made me, especially when it's happened amongst people who profess to be followers of Christ. And I know how much that is inconsistent with who God is when discrimination has happened in that way. So I've become more fiery about the topic, but I've held the belief for probably most of my life, yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious to know what advice you might have for those who might have a hard time interacting with Christianity because of racist behavior or sentiments that are sometimes demonstrated by those who would call themselves Christians.
Yeah, that is one of the things that saddens me the most in this dynamic, is that the injustices that have been done by people who profess to be followers of Christ. And so the advice that I would have for those who are wrestling with this would be to seek God on your own, right? To actually take the Bible and begin to read, not, if it's possible, not through the lens of the experiences that you've had, but just to begin to read. Because as you read the Bible, especially in the New Testament, Jesus's teachings, it's clear that the practices that have happened across the world that have been discriminatory in the name of God were not true to God's character. And so for those who have experienced and suffered at that hand of those who have been Christ followers, I apologize. That grieves me to know that that's the reality of people's story. And yet I know I've experienced it myself. But I would encourage, if you're seeking, to learn and search out God on your own and not just camp in the experiences, the negative experiences that one may have had.
Thanks, Rose. As we're talking about looking at the Bible ourselves, there's a question that's been submitted. Why did God choose the Israelites as his people? And what are the implications of that on race?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is I have no idea. But one thing that was clear was that his plan was never to only care for one people. So in Genesis, when God first connects with Abraham and he says to him, through you, all people on the earth will be blessed. So there was never these are the better people and these are the lesser people. The posturing of God was, I'm working through this one person to be able to bless everybody. And I'm working through this people group to be a blessing to everybody. And so even I think sometimes our distortion in how we've talked about the story of the Israelites has almost been like they were the only ones and God just kind of ignored everybody else. And that's not, he communicated from the very beginning that his intention was to bless the whole earth and bless all the peoples of the earth. So again, I think it's some of that distortion of how we've told the story of God that has lent to some racism and what that's meant. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, wouldn't God's primary focus be on the everlasting form that we truly are, the soul, created by God and defined by characteristics that transcend the material.
That's interesting. Yeah. I think where I wrestle with that, I think God does care about our souls. But apparently in this vision that the writer of the book of Revelation has in John, he doesn't just see souls. He sees people who look differently. He obviously hears different languages for him to know and to write that what he's seeing are people from every nation, every people group, every tribe. And so while our souls are eternal, apparently there is a value of our outward appearance because that's the vision that God gives him. He doesn't just see gray, translucent souls. He sees them embodied in some way. And so God obviously places value on what he did and what he created.
Thanks. The next question is, how can we respond lovingly to those who discriminate based on race or ethnicity around us?
Yeah, hard question. Because sometimes it's hard, right? When people are discriminating. And I think what's important is remembering that we are all created in the image of God. That the image of God that I bear or that you bear is not based on how nice you are or how kind you are. It's because you're bearing God's image, because you're a human being. And so my kindness, my response to you is out of my appreciation that you bear the image of God. And for those of us who are Christ followers, you know, Jesus talked about kind of that upside down, being kind to those who treat you wrong. That was one of the many things he shared on the Sermon of the Mount, that makes, that's the uniqueness of those who follow Christ, is to be kind to those who treat us wrongly. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't speak to it. It doesn't mean that I don't address it, that I don't help you understand what you're doing is inappropriate. But it does mean that I do it in a way that reflects the image of God. Yeah, and I don't always get that right. Let me just say that now, so that you don't think I do it right all the time. I don't, but I desire
Me
to.
neither. It's hard.
It's very hard.
The next question is, weren't different cultures, languages due to the building of the Tower of Babel or Babel as a punishment? If so, why should different cultures and languages be celebrated?
Great question. So for those who don't know, in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, at chapter 11, there is a story of, at that point in time, that everyone had the same language, people were the same. They start building, they come to a city called Shinar, they start building a tower, and God looks down and says, you know, they're building a tower to get to God. Their desire is to make a name for themselves. And he comes down and separates everyone and gives different languages. What's interesting is that the motivation that causes God to step down is the fact that people's motives for building this tower are wrong. He actually had wanted the whole earth to be filled with people. From the very beginning, fill the whole earth with people. It's said over and over and over again. And what happens is people stop moving. They sit right in this one town. And so the desire was, okay, you know, the earth needs to be filled. And so in his division, it was to stop the earth needs to be filled. The motive for everyone coming together is wrong. And so the one way to be able to get things moving again back is to separate the languages and confuse the languages. The beauty is that there is a redemption of that in Acts 2. And so in the book of Acts, written by Dr. Luke, who's also a historian, he talks about when, after Jesus has left the earth and his followers start preaching, people from every nation come together and hear this message of Jesus and hear it in their own language. And it actually is, when you're looking at those two passages, it is almost a reversal and the redemption of what happened at the Tower of Babel. And that there's this celebration. Now it's interesting because they could have all heard one language, but that's not what happens. Each person hears in their mother tongue. And so there's this validation of the individual languages, and it is redeemed. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered the question. What was the question? Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if it was a punishment, then why should the different cultures and languages be celebrated?
Yeah, I think God makes it clear in the New Testament, the celebration of different cultures. And again, I keep going back to that picture of when evil's eradicated from the world. The picture at the end is a celebration of different cultures. It is a celebration of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. So if God thought it worthy to give that as a vision, I think it's worth us celebrating. Yeah.
The next question is, how should we face or control our inner racist or stereotypical thoughts? Does the Bible or religion help on this?
Yeah. I appreciate that question. Because the reality is we all have biases, right? We all, because we live in a racialized society, we all have the narrative in our heads that sometimes may surprise us at points, right? And so I think the challenge to that is being honest with yourself, is not ignoring it, is not pretending like it doesn't exist, being honest with yourself that, yep, that thought that just came through my head was racist. It was a stereotype, and that's not true. Especially if you're able to engage with others of a different culture, to be able to learn more. I don't believe in condemning yourself and beating yourself up about that. It is the product of living in a racialized society, but being intentional to challenge ourselves in how we are thinking about other people. If we don't challenge our thoughts, it will continue. And I think the beauty of this season of time that we're living in right now is that there's so much going on around us to challenge us. I think it takes more intentionality to choose to stay in a state of ignoring diversity than to embrace it and to allow ourselves to grow.
The next question is, what are your thoughts on Christian missionaries who travel to other areas that are often have indigenous religious practices with the aim of conversion?
Ooh, mercy. Okay, as a Christian missionary, you know, I think that we're beginning to have a greater appreciation for respecting God's image in different cultures and seeing how God's glory is manifested in different cultures, and being able to spend some time. I think where we've not done well in the past is spending time to see how is God reflected in some of the practices that are being done. Historically, what would often happen would be a jump to this is wrong. And so we jump to making it Western and identify Western as Christian, as opposed to being able to see, is God's glory being reflected in this practice? And then what does it look like to talk about the person of Jesus? And what does it mean to help someone understand what it means to have a relationship with him, not outside of their culture, not putting down their culture, not laying aside their culture, but in the beauty of their culture. It requires us as missionaries and those who go as missionaries to be willing to take more time to stop and learn and pay attention. Again, in Acts 17, you see the Apostle Paul do this. He's walking around Athens, and he takes time to look at what's going on, and he uses their own poetry. He uses their own culture to talk to them about God. And I don't think we've done that historically enough in the past. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I start talking and then I'm like, did I answer the question? So yeah.
Thanks. We only have time for one more question, so this will probably be our last question. But the question is, if race is a social construct, is ethnicity a social construct as well?
In some ways, yes, because of the fact that the reality is that we do have groups of people who share a culture, who share traditions. The issue of race being a social construct was because it was based on physical trait, which there's no biological proof of this classification. But with ethnicity, you do have people who are in the same geographic area who share cultural commonalities. And so in the sense of, was it devised by human beings as a way to identify and classify human beings? Yes. But there's more validity to the reality of ethnicity, the cultural, the religious, the language, those dynamics. That's not saying that this is scientifically based. This isn't biologically based. It is more cultural, and that's where ethnicity comes from. So.
Thank you so much, Rose, for taking our questions.
Oh,
I'm sure there may be more, but yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks, Esther, for moderating that as well. I know there were a lot of great questions, and if you didn't have a question answered, feel free to come talk to us up front. But for now, we're going to officially close. I just have a couple of reminders for you to fill out that feedback form. Sign up for Christianity Explored if you're interested in it. And our last event of the week, I can't believe we're already at the end of Friday, but will be tonight. It is an art exhibit on what does it mean to be human? A great question to think about. So there'll be an art exhibit tonight. It's going to be from 7 to 9 p.m. at Trinity College. There's free admission, and we really hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.